France was given away with Catherine of France shamefully to the English. France was destroyed with a woman, but was restored by a virgin farm girl from Don Remy in Aube, in Armagnac, in Champagne. A virgin Champagne girl that chose not to use her father's name so much and go by Jeanne Purcell, the maiden, accentuating her virginity with her name, chosen name. Virginity never really had the same connotation in those old times as it does now. It was highly valued, but was more akin to celibacy and education and acting like a man, rather than an emotional banshee. Seriousness and sobriety increased her status to almost a man, but at the time even a street prostitute could change their ways and become almost a serious and sober man. Learning and asceticism assisted this social acceptability climbing. The 100 Years' War between England and France. France destroyed by woman, but restored by a virgin. It almost makes France the Garden of Eden. And perhaps it is, after some Armagnac, in your Champagne. Troyes is a beautiful half-timbered town in the Champagne region of northern France, slightly southeast of Paris. Well worth a stop on any long drive north or south through the B roads, but even péage. Try and make it for a market day, marché, and sample some of the local produce. Consider this a treatise, if you will, to treat yourself to a trip to Troyes. Troyes is a place where something shameful happened. Henry V of England married Catherine of France, whose mothers were Bavarian, at Saint-Jean-au-Marché Cathedral. Shameful because the whole of France had been given to Britain, England, with the marriage of a woman, who in the language of the time, women were shameful and men were honourable. This was the time of the 100 Years' War between England and France. The English territories being northern France, Gascony, Burgundy was on their side, and of course the Isle of Albion. France at the time being little more than what was to be Vichy France much later, and a little bit of Haute France around Calais with a bit of Belgium. Two separate morsels, north and south of the English. But most famously, perhaps, Troyes was besieged in 1429 by a woman, Joan of Arc. Joan besieged Troyes and won. She had pledged to kick the English out of France. I think some of my French neighbours have got a similar idea. And famously, Jeanne Purcell, as she liked to refer to herself, the maiden. Purcell, the maiden, repulsed the English out of Orleans as well. That symbol of Frenchness. All was going well, and the banner that she'd designed herself was successful and popular. It all started going wrong. Siege of Paris and the Siege of Charité weren't so successful, and the church started turning on her. The fact that she was wearing men's clothes and soldiers' clothes among soldiers was considered a blasphemy all of a sudden, and her visions were demonic, that she was acting upon them. She was accused of heresy and witchcraft, and perhaps, worst of all, that she didn't recognise the church's authority in bringing these accusations against her. And she was burned at the stake. Some 15 years later, when the French had finally beaten back the English invaders in 1456, she was perhaps rehydrated, and I don't know, and the Rehabilitation trial was ordered by Charles VII, who came to the throne after two other had died within a couple of months of each other. It wasn't until 1920, though, that Joan of Arc became a saint and a hero of France. That shameful Treaty of Troyes that gave Catherine of France and France to Henry V is actually now seen as really quite progressive in terms that a treaty is part of an ongoing dialogue between people, which is seen as a foundation of peace. As we speak, there is Russian and American cooperation at space stations in space. France will be destroyed by a woman, but restored by a virgin. This is a famous quote, a prophecy, but on a personal level, something that French men identify with, perhaps on a personal level. It's also a claim that much of Africa wrongly considers is a cure for AIDS. France is destroyed by woman, but restored by a virgin, is the prophecy of Marie Robin of Avignon, and reportedly Merlin. Avignon once a papal seat, while Rome wasn't. Joan the maiden of Arc, Jeanne Purcelle d'Arc, her father's name, was actually born in Don Remy, in the Champagne region. Troyes is in Aube region. Amongst others, could be considered to be a tourist centre for the Champagne region. A heroic maiden is Armagnac born. Armagnac was being invaded by Burgundy. They invaded once and killed all the village of Don Remy's cattle. Second time, the Burgundy army for the English attacked the village of Don Remy. They burnt it to the ground. It was after this that Joan, the maiden, started claiming her visions. She would have visions of Archangel Gabriel, St. Michael, St. Margaret and St. Catherine. The Church of St. Catherine is on Mount Sinai, where Moses found his burning coffee bush, and is closely linked with the warrior St. Michael. St. Margaret was very generous to her followers, but St. Michael, amongst other things, was able to bring fallen angels out of hell. He escorted you on your day of judgment as well. But a warrior saint, very useful. She's supposed to have had these visions partly triggered by the sound of bells. Bells would be sounded with the attack of the Armagnac village by Burgundy. Perhaps it's linked to a traumatic event. Perhaps she managed to escape and she was the only virgin left in the village. With details of her visions, she went off to Chinon, the bend in the river of the Loire. Wonderfully fruity wines. It was rather front line at the time. Wanting to fight. Nancy, she went off to, wanting to fight. The Duke of Lorraine summoned her to hear about visions and wanting to be cured of his ills. However, he was just reprimanded by our maiden Joan for living with his mistress. She went off to Poitiers. There was no immorality, sorcery or heresy accusations at this time. She started on the Loire campaign, westwards, with success enough that they were able to enter Reims with the support of the local people unopposed, where Charles V was able to be crowned King of France, with Joan the Maiden by his side. No, not in that way. He couldn't deflower the maiden, take down her potency in the eyes of everyone, and sully himself with a farm girl at the same time. Jeanne Purcelle d'Arc couldn't read or write. By the end of her life, she could just about write her name, like Joan, on her confession. All the bells ringing in Reims for the coronation of the king. The visions must have come thick and fast. Charles had her examined by a lot of priests and also by his mum's handmaidens. And she was declared intact and pure. No one's going to be saying, "Oh, we've all made a great mistake. She's really successful," but try and get to the Hôtel Dieu Le Comte. In the 100 Years' War between England and France, France was given away with Catherine of France shamefully to the English. France was destroyed with a woman, but was restored by a virgin farm girl.
Our love was bad from the day it was born. Its faults were vast as the sands on the shore. But we were blind, we thought love conquered all. We couldn't see that we soon had to fall. And
100 Years' War between England and France. France was given away with Catherine of France shamefully to the English. France was destroyed with a woman, but was restored by a virgin farm girl from Don Remy in Aube, in Armagnac, in Champagne. A virgin Champagne girl that chose not to use her father's name so much and go by Jeanne Purcelle, the maiden, accentuating her virginity with her name, chosen name. virginity never really had the same connotation in those old times as it does now. It was valued. It was more akin to celibacy, education, and active life of rather than emotional connection. Seriousness and sobriety increased. They're both more. But the extreme prostitute could change their ways and realised that seriously sober maybe asceticism, persistence, social acceptance, France, destroyed by woman, but restored by a virgin. It almost makes France the Garden of Eden. And perhaps it is, after some Armagnac, in your Champagne. Troyes is a beautiful half-timbered town in the Champagne region of northern France, slightly southeast of Paris. Well worth a stop on any long drive north or south through the B roads, but even Péage. Try and make it for a market day, marché, and sample some of the local produce.
Sands in our glass have come to an end.
So, by 14, the intelligent but illiterate Joan, the maiden, was hearing voices of Micheal, Catherine of Alexandria, Margaret of Antioch. By 17, she'd met the king and was the figurehead of a great military campaign, and by 19, she was burnt at the stake. Well, you could say she was a high achiever. Did she have ADHD or something? Was she schizophrenic? She might have had a seizure disorder. The clarity of her consciousness and thought between episodes, and the reasonable of her self-defence at her show trial, might suggest she was psychotic or psychopathic or epileptic. She was always quick with a comeback quip. It wasn't until the third time she heard the voices, the visions, that Joan realised they were the voices of the saints Margaret, Catherine and Micheal. At her show trial, at the end of those 5 glorious years, she was asked, "Does not St. Margaret speak English?" Joan's reply was, "Why should she speak English when she's not on the English side?" But with any courtroom there's a bias, and anything recorded could be fake news. I was 13 when I had a voice from God for my help and guidance. The first time that I heard this voice, I was very much frightened. I heard this voice to my right. Rarely do I hear it without it being accompanied also by a light. This light comes from the same side as the voice. Now, at the time, it was believed anatomically that if the egg descended from the left-hand fallopian tube of a woman and was met by the sperm, it would be a woman or an effeminate man, and if the egg came from the right fallopian tube, it would be a man, a boy. Right was right, and left was inferior. If what was recorded at the trial was bias, then would an American psychiatrist doing an analysis might also be biased against a hero of France? Quite possibly. In large part from the trial of Rehabilitation, physicians now, in modern times, have suggested that the fact that Joan took comfort from the voices and visions suggests ecstatic auras, evidence that her hallucinations were triggered by church bells, aligns with reflex epilepsy. Did she have a temporal lobe tuberculoma from bovine tuberculosis, a common affliction of the time, being a farm girl? Recent reanalysis of Joan of Arc's testimony concluded that she likely had autosomal dominant lateral temporal epilepsy or idiopathic partial epilepsy with auditory features. A partial seizures diagnosis, even bearing in mind the biases of the political trial, after being captured by the English and injured at the siege of Orleans. Even the evolution of personal and cultural meaning in Joan's hallucinatory experience is consistent with the partial seizures diagnosis. Neuropsychiatric perspective reminds us that all mental phenomena are within the brain's repertoire and simultaneously expressive of personal and cultural meaning. In 15th century France, Joan knew the voices were from God and heavenly guidance. Along with Joan's personal talents, catalysed her courage to break the bounds of expected behaviour for young maidens in order to fight for her country. Everyone was needed, like World War Russia, and she had a few lucky coincidences. Jeanne le purcelle, Joan the maid, undoubtedly wanted forevermore to be a martyr for France, claiming not to know her family name, but then in her home village of Domremy, daughters often took the name of the mother, the family name of the mother. Attend church and live piously, the voices said to Joan to start off with, but they started to go much further, instructing her to deliver France from the invading English and establish Charles VII, the uncrowned heir of the French throne, as the country's rightful king. And when the bells sounded, it was much more distinct. The voices and the bright lights. Psychiatric conditions do trigger hallucinations or delusions, including migraines, bipolar disorder, and brain lesions. If the bovine tuberculosis was to blame, dementia would have surely followed. Unpasteurised milk can be all that's to blame. If it wasn't for that unpasteurised milk, France, the Garden of Eden, would be English. There wouldn't have been any fighting over the Americas. Germany wouldn't have stood a chance. And there would have been no need for the Balfour Agreement. I don't have issues myself. Though remembered as a fearless warrior and considered a heroine of the 100 Years' War between France and England, Joan never actually fought in a battle or killed an opponent. She would accompany her men as a sort of inspirational mascot, brandishing her banner in place of a weapon. She was also responsible for outlining military strategies, directing troops, and proposing diplomatic solutions to the English, all of which they rejected. Despite her distance from the front lines, Joan was wounded at least twice, taking an arrow to the shoulder during her famed Orleans campaign, and a crossbow bolt to the thigh during a failed bid to liberate Paris. It's not said how she felt about the crossbow bolt to the thigh. Was she really a figurehead, a spokesperson, or were the voices of Micheal, the warrior, St. Michael, dictating military strategy for the French? Once the maiden had the French army at her disposal, the teenage peasant didn't hesitate to chew out prestigious knights for swearing, behaving indecently, skipping mass, or dismissing her battle plans. She even accused her noble patrons of spinelessness in their dealings with the English. According to witnesses at her trial, Joan once tried to slap a Scottish soldier. The Scots teamed up with France during the 100 Years' War. Eating stolen meat was all the Scottish soldier had had to do in order to get a slap from the teenager. Joan le purcelle also supposedly drove away the mistresses and the prostitutes who travelled with her army at sword point, hitting one or two in the process. And personal attacks by the English, who called her rude names and joked that she should return home to her cows, reportedly made Joan's blood boil. Joan Purcell's short fuse is evident in transcripts of her court hearings when a clergyman with a thick regional accent asked what language her voices spoke, for instance. She retorted that they spoke French, far better than he did. The document, the confession that illiterate Joan signed, confessing her sins and promising to change her ways, the ecclesiastical court dropped 70 charges, including horse theft, down to just 12. She'd kept her armour on in prison as protection up till that point, but several days after the confession, perhaps due to threats of violence or rape from her guards, Joan put her male attire back on. Then she told the angry judges who visited her cell that her voices had reappeared. It was these two acts that earned Joan a conviction as a relapsed heretic, and it was that sent her to be burnt at the stake, rather than impaled as a vampire. But after her death, her brothers staged a sort of resurrection by using several women. Claude d'Amoise looked like her and had participated in military campaigns dressed in men's clothing. The brothers really used it as a freeloading thing, going from festive occasion to festive occasion with stories of how Joan had married a knight after escaping. But when they climbed so high as to meet Charles the Seventh, who Joan had pretty much put in place, they confessed and they were given prominent roles. They were sort of forgiven for their honesty, their little joke. And the two brothers were used to petition Pope Calixtus III for Joan's exoneration, après defeat of the English. What about the resurrection woman looked like Joan? Well, it could have been just the bob haircut, perhaps. The voices had told Joan to crop her long hair. She wore it in the page boy style common among knights of her era until guards shaved her head shortly before her execution. 1909, France's most fashionable stylists, Monsieur Anton, a Polish, tressed many a bob, and in the 1920s really caught on in silent film stars and the flapper set. The English in the 1960s went for a similar bobbed haircut for women. Monsieur Anton's experiment of dyeing his dog's hair blue never really caught on. Charles V of France thought he was made of glass and had clothing with iron ribs cut into it so that he'd be more reinforced and less likely to break. The slightest bump could shatter him. This is a concern nowadays for metropolitan intellectuals, shall we say? I'm just saying that the lawyers, the physicians and the church military that Joan would have debated with were very aware of mental illness. Charles the son had a pus-weeping arm for many years. If it ever was to stop, he would shortly die. Joan of Arc, bold and commanding in men's clothing, so the prejudice goes, quite enjoyed women's clothing the rest of the time and was quiet, sweet and demure in women's attire. Saint Bede the Vulnerable was who was mainly responsible for circulating the prophecies in the kingdom long before Joan left Domremy village and told of an armed woman that would come from the borders of Lorraine and save France. For the Dauphin and France, Joan was just the incarnation of the prophecy. Superstitious were her troops, undoubtedly, but they would have been a vernacular lot. Demoralised, they needed her charisma, being cared for. She was confident and courageous, sure of her beliefs that God was behind her. Her enthusiasm, her determination were contagious, teamed with modesty and virtue. She slept with women at night, or fully clothed if there weren't any women to sleep with. It was common practice in those days. Though she fasted in piety and devotion early on, her prophetic abilities were definitely not through malnutrition or starvation-induced hallucinations. A rusty sword deeply buried in the chapel of St. Catherine de Fierbois was found exactly where Joan, the maid, said it would be, and she took this as her sword rather than the one offered to her. She predicted her own capture, injury. She had declared that she was expecting deliverance after her trial, and she did get it of sorts, and then again manyfold after her death. There are some amongst you crying out, psilocybins, or were they peduncular hallucinations? Did she have lesions in the midbrain? These visions can be elaborate and can include faces. Jeanne described St. Catherine and St. Margaret as having faces, adorned with beautiful crowns, very rich and precious. Sometimes she did see more, but calm amusement and emotional flatness. Yeah, perhaps to some of the hallucinations. Temporal lobe epilepsy. Visionaries get described as, but that often involves staring into space. Not only seeing and hearing things that aren't there, but smelling non-existent odours. No seizures, but hyperreligious is a symptom. Attention, concentration and memory not affected. Flushing, sweating, going very pale, churning in the stomach. Auras can be seen by the temporal lobe epileptic. After the aura, spaced out, no mental contact with the world. Chewing, lip smacking. After a seizure, they would be confused and drowsy. She did vacillate between talking about herself in the first person and the third person. Joan's voices came many times a day during her imprisonment, so temporal lobe epilepsy has to be ruled out, really, because it would have been very noticeable. A lazy analysis. Was Joan of Arc schizophrenic? And slightly ignorant, because there's lots of different forms of schizophrenia. Hallucinations and delusions are very overt symptoms. Audio, visual, some olfactory, smelling, kinesthetic, feeling, or gustatory hallucinations, tasting. Joan would have had all of them. She met St. Catherine and St. Margaret. She embraced them, she kissed their feet and noted they smelled good. And she could summon the voices by praying, though they also came unsummoned. Prominent hallucinations throughout the day, voices running commentary on the person, and 2 or more voices conversing with each other. Yep, Joan had all of those. There's not a day that saints don't come to her castle, and never without the light. Almost. They encouraged and commanded and conversed with her without occasionally. Schizophrenics' delusions might be grandiose. They believe they're powerful, omnipotent, on a mission from God, directly from heaven. It could well start in adolescence, as any secondary teacher could tell you. Joan had a clear sense of purpose in her preoccupation. Perhaps Joan of Arc's failures militarily were the onset of something that could be clinically diagnosed. She had always been a hard-working girl, going to church every day and helping the poor. There was no real bizarre behaviour, incomprehensible talking, depression, anxiety, suicidal behaviours, thought confusions. Can't think straight or concentrate. Distractible. No, Aunt Joan didn't really have any of those. She could get vexed at times, but of a frustration kind rather than anxiety. Even her leap from the tower at Beaurevoir wasn't suicidal at the time. She was clear and focused and won so much loyalty, with her intelligence and brilliant memory. Schizophrenia does ebb and flow. There can be periods of calm with lack of human emotion, social withdrawal, loss of energy, interest, and a decrease in warmth, humour and motivation. She was extremely sensitive and showed much emotion, weeping constantly for the losses on either side of the battle, climbing down from her horse to comfort a dying English soldier. She was brave but felt fear, and felt and expressed outrage when troops cursed. She didn't shy away from others. It's the lack of supporting symptoms which make it difficult to accept Joan of Arc as a schizophrenic, only the overt hallucinations and delusions. While schizophrenia is not the obvious conclusion, if Joan's voices did come from her own mind, the vague diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder may be all that American psychoanalysis has got to discredit our French heroine. They have got their own, haven't they? Who or what is the American heroine of the people?
I got a big on my mind, 'cause it's a blue sort of Monday time.